Okay, we are a few minutes after noon, so I think we will go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to our webinar on medical facts and legal options regarding the COVID-19 vaccine. My name is Lee Bonsall. I'm a partner in the Labor and Employment Group here at Hinshaw Culbertson. We are very excited about today's webinar due to its focus on both the medical and legal issues surrounding the COVID-19 vaccine. So we thought that rather than just presenting a list of legal issues, it would be helpful for those of you who are working in human resources or management or advising employers to both get an understanding of the medical facts regarding the vaccine and the corresponding legal issues to then be able to create and implement the appropriate plans and policies for your workforce. I am going to be moderating today between our two experts, Dr. Segretti, who will be our expert on medical facts regarding the vaccine, and Tom Luckemeyer, who is our expert on the legal implications. A lot of questions I will go over are ones that we have been receiving from clients, so hopefully they are helpful for this whole group. But if any of you have any questions that come up during the discussion today, please submit those through the Q&A function in Zoom, and I'll do my best to get to those. I would not be doing my job introducing a legal webinar without a disclaimer. So here it is. The information presented under any circumstance. You should not act or rely on any information provided without seeking the advice of a licensed medical professional or an attorney licensed to practice in your jurisdiction for your particular situation. In addition, the information presented during this session does not necessarily reflect the opinions of our clients, firm, or Rush University Medical Center. With that, I will keep the introductions short so we can get to the content. We have with us today Dr. Segretti, who is an infectious disease specialist at Rush University. He is also a professor at Rush Medical College, and we are very fortunate to have Dr. Segretti here today to share his knowledge regarding infectious diseases and the COVID-19 vaccine. Tom Luckemeyer is a partner in Hinshaw's Labor and Employment Group, and he is also a professor of labor law and employment discrimination at Loyola University. So we will start out the webinar with Tom giving a brief overview of the potential legal issues in regard to the vaccine, and then we'll move right into the Q&A. So I will turn it over to Tom.
Thanks, Lee. I always have to be warned to be brief, and today I am going to do so as I just lay the groundwork for the legal issues. Because we do want to get to the two primary objectives of this webinar, which is the interplay between the medical issues and the law, of course, your questions. So the general rule is that an employer, even a public employer, can make vaccines mandatory. However, like most general rules, there are exceptions. And here's what you need to know about the exceptions, and there are 5 that you need to be aware of. First, in the event there is a disability or an underlying medical condition, you must make an individualized determination and consider accommodations. Nothing new about that. Second, in the event you have a religious objection from an employee, that too must be considered and accommodated at a different level. Nothing new about that. Third, if you are a unionized employer, you must consider collective bargaining obligations under the National Labor Relations Act or corresponding state law and determine if the issue is covered. If not, is it within management rights and whether notice is appropriate to the union. Again, nothing unusual about that. Where employers tend to trip up a little bit are in the 4th and 5th issues. Fourth, we have to recognize that individual and group objections may be considered concerted protected activity, as that phrase is understood under the National Labor Relations Act. And all employees, even those without union affiliation in the picture, have Section 7 rights under the NLRA and corresponding state law. And lastly, we have to be mindful that there are multiple anti-retaliation provisions that are in existence among any number of laws, including OSHA, the FFCRA, and corresponding state law. And we're going to be discussing and coming back to each of these 5 issues in the context of the questions we have already received from the participants in the webinar today. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to you, Lee, to get us right into the questions we've been receiving from the audience.
Great. So I'm going to start out with some questions we've received on basics of the vaccine, and then move into issues with employees receiving the vaccine, whether that is mandatory or voluntary, and then conclude with workplace issues after employees have been vaccinated. So Dr. Segretti, hello again, and thank you for being with us. Just to start off, could you give us a brief overview of the vaccines that are available at this point and who here in Chicago is eligible to get the vaccine?
Okay, thank you. And thank you for asking me to participate in this. Sure, I'm going to learn a lot myself. As far as the vaccines that are currently available, there are two vaccines. One is made by Moderna, the other one is made by Pfizer. There is a very good possibility that we will get two more vaccines within the next month to 2 months, one from Johnson & Johnson and one from AstraZeneca. And they'll probably be applying for an emergency use approval in the next few weeks. And in terms of who's eligible to get the vaccine, the CDC and the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices has put forth a guideline on who should get vaccinated first, and the Illinois Department of Public Health and Chicago Department of Public Health are going pretty closely to that framework. And they have basically 4 phases. It used to be phase 1, 2, 3, and 4, but for some reason they decided to do a phase 1A, 1B, 1C, and phase 2 to make people feel better, I suppose, so they're not in phase 4. But phase 1A is healthcare workers and long-term care facility residents and staff. And we started vaccinating that population in December and have pretty much completed vaccination of people that want to get vaccinated. We are now, as of January 25th, Illinois started vaccinating 1B, and those are frontline essential workers, people over 65 years of age, and people in non-healthcare residential settings. And we expect that it'll take us at least 2 months to immunize enough of those people where we can move on to 1C.
Okay, so would 1C start to cover more broadly individuals under 65?
Correct. That would be other essential workers who aren't frontline essential workers and people between the age of 16 and 64 with underlying medical conditions. And then phase 2 is everybody else.
Okay, got it. So I know these are all estimates at this point, but what do you think in terms of timeframes for 1C and beyond?
Yeah, the current timeline that CDPH and IDPH are working on is that February and March will be for 1B, and then April and May for 1C, and then phase 2 would be starting at the end of May, beginning of June, and would take 5 to 6 months.
Okay. And at this point in time, where can someone go to get the vaccine?
Yeah, well, the city and the Cook County have set up different sites for different populations. There's currently a pod for healthcare workers who want to get vaccinated in frontline, essential workers throughout the city. Most of the vaccinations, though, have occurred at various healthcare facilities. And the reason that's the case is that both of these vaccines require freezing at fairly low temperatures. Pfizer requires storage at minus 70 degrees Celsius and Moderna at minus 20 degrees Celsius. So it's pretty difficult to give this out to everybody who wants to vaccinate someone because of the complication of the storage. Also, these do not come in ready-to-use vials. They come in multi-dose vials that have to be prepared usually by a pharmacist. So it makes it very difficult for this to be given out to someone just to put in their refrigerator and then give to someone whenever they want to give it to them. So it does, that is a complication of the vaccine. And the other complication is that both of these have been approved for 2 doses. So Pfizer is given a 3-week interval, Moderna 4-week interval. So you have to get the vaccine, immunize people, and then give them a follow-up appointment in 3 to 4 weeks. And the preparation is usually by a pharmacist to drop into the syringe, and the syringes and are being provided by the government. And so depending on the syringe, we sometimes get more out of a vial than what's been stated. So so there are some complications with these vaccines that they're not easy to administer. Some of the advantages of newer vaccines hopefully will be that they won't have to be stored at such low temperatures. They can be stored in a refrigerator, and some of them might be coming in ready-to-use syringes. So, and one of them, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, is a single injection. So those are all some of the potential advantages of newer vaccines.
Okay, great, thank you. Tom, I'm going to turn it to you for a legal question now. As the vaccine becomes more widely available, and if we get to a point where it's easier to be administered, are there any issues with an employer keeping records regarding which employees were vaccinated, or requesting or requiring proof of vaccination?
Thank you. That's actually a good first question, because it also corresponds with 3 of the questions we just received from the Q&A from the audience. In its December guidance, the EEOC said that an employee receiving a vaccination approved by the FDA would not be considered a medical exam for purposes of the ADA. Therefore, employers can keep a log of those employees who have been vaccinated, keeping a log, that is. The EEOC guidance also says that asking employees if they have been vaccinated will not cause employers to run afoul of the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, which is also known as GINA. However, where employers can get into trouble is with pre-screening questions if they're working with a vendor to administer the vaccinations, or if they just ask a broad general question why an employee has not been vaccinated. Such a broad question might elicit information about disabilities that's unnecessary to the entire process. And so under the circumstances, the best way to do it, or the one way to do it, is to encourage employees to get the vaccine, and then to encourage those employees who have not complied with the mandatory vaccination policy to consult with HR. And at that point, the employees can be asked if they have a religious objection, or will be invited to talk about the mandatory vaccine and their compliance. Usually, it's at that point there will be an articulation of either a religious objection or a disability objection. Once it's raised by the employee, then the door is wide open for the employer to begin the accommodation process and start talking about it. So avoid broad-based questions. Make sure they're all directed to HR, so HR can handle them in a consistent and non-intrusive way.
Okay, thank you, Tom. Dr. Segretti, back to you. Could you tell us a little bit about the effectiveness of the vaccines that are currently being used?
Yeah, the great news about the vaccines that are here and the ones that will be available is that they seem to be very effective. Now, to put that in perspective, the flu vaccine varies in effectiveness from year to year. And when we 50–60% effectiveness, that's considered a good match. And in a bad match, it's 30 to 40% effectiveness. So that's kind of the baseline we're looking at. The Moderna and Pfizer vaccine, based on their studies, are saying that they're 95% effective. And that means that 95% of the people that got sick during the study were in the placebo arm. 5% of the people who got infected were in the vaccine arm. If you take a look at things like measles, it's more like that's about 95 to 99% effectiveness. So the current effectiveness that's reported is very good, is excellent, much better than we had predicted. The AstraZeneca vaccine is reporting about 70% effectiveness, and the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is reporting about 66% effectiveness in preventing illness. And again, those sound low compared to the ones that are currently available, but much better than flu vaccine. And the newer vaccines may have other attributes that make them potentially more attractive than the current vaccines, because they might be easier to use and easier to give to a broader population.
Okay, well, that's very good news. A question we received from a lot of clients leading up to today was about any risks regarding receiving the vaccine, given the very fast-tracked approval process.
Yeah, this has been a very common concern that people have had, and we get this question from a lot of healthcare people as well. And even though it was produced very quickly and came on board very quickly, that's because we had a great need to have something. If you take a look at the approval process itself, the approval process was basically the same as any other vaccine. They had to do a large placebo-controlled study. They had to prove effectiveness, and they had to prove safety. Now, what was accelerated is the production of the vaccine, and that's because of the methodology that's used. They can ramp up production a lot faster than a traditional vaccine like a flu vaccine, and the bureaucracy was accelerated so that the FDA moved very quickly on this rather than a lot of the bureaucratic delays that are with other products. So everyone realized that we had to get something out very quickly. What was not compromised was the integrity of the studies and the integrity of the data collection for efficacy and safety. So I feel very comfortable with the safety and efficacy of the vaccine, and I have received the vaccine, and I would recommend it for everyone.
I guess my next question, we'll see if there are any exceptions to that rule. So I think the question a lot of employers are going to have is, are there individuals with certain medical conditions who should not get the vaccination?
Yeah, the only contraindication for both the current vaccines are a history of anaphylaxis to the vaccine. So you got the first dose, you had anaphylaxis or severe allergic reaction, you shouldn't get the second dose. Or if you have a history of anaphylaxis or severe allergic reaction to any of the components of the vaccine. And those are the only contraindications. There are warnings for pregnancy. Since pregnant women were not included in the trials, we still don't have data on safety in pregnancy. However, the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, the American Academy of Obstetrics and Gynecology, or the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology, and maternal fetal associations have all recommended that if a woman is pregnant and is in high-risk category and recommended to get the vaccine, they should consider getting the vaccine after they've talked about the risks and benefits with their personal doctor. It's not a contraindication. There's no reason to think that it'll be harmful in pregnancy. And we're getting more and more information that pregnant women are at greater risk of having bad outcomes if they do get infected. So in weighing, but every woman has to make that decision for themselves. And, you know, and so for now, until there is more information on the safety, we are leaving it to each woman to decide that for themselves. But in my opinion, the benefits of the vaccine far outweigh any risks or any potential risks.
Okay, and I just thought,
those are the only populations where there's some controversy. Breastfeeding, there isn't any evidence that interferes or does any harm to the infant. But again, every woman needs to make that decision on her own as to whether or not they want to assume the risks of taking the vaccine and the risks of not taking the vaccine. In terms of immunocompromised patients, there's, believe it or not, there's no standard definition of what immunocompromised is. And so that really is very subjective and left up to individual physicians. And while certain people with comorbidities were included in the trial, so people with asthma, people with COPD, people with diabetes, people with hypertension, they were in the studies. They did fine. They did just as well as people without those conditions. They had no safety signals during this study. But if someone has cancer, someone has advanced HIV, someone is on chemotherapy or high dose steroids, those people were not included in the trials. However, those are the people we expect to see the greatest benefits. Now, the vaccine may not be as effective in those patient populations, but it's not expected to do any harm either.
okay, very good. We got a question in from the audience that I think fits in well here. What about someone who's already had COVID? Should they receive the vaccine?
Yeah, that's another very common question, and that's been addressed as well by CDC and the advisory committee. And they recommend that people get vaccinated, even if they've had natural immunity from being infected. And however, the one caveat is that there's been virtually no reinfection within 90 days of infection. And so if someone wants to defer vaccine for 90 days afterwards, that's up to them. The recommendation, again, has been if it's your turn to get vaccinated and vaccine is available, get the vaccine, as long as you're not actively infected and still in isolation. If you're in isolation or in quarantine, you should wait until you're out of isolation, you're out of quarantine to get the vaccine. But I strongly recommend getting the vaccine. There's some theoretical advantages of the vaccine potentially being more protective than natural infection. Again, we don't have any hard evidence of that, but theoretically, that's the immune response to the vaccine is measured by immunoglobulin levels is a little bit higher than with natural infection. Whether that translates to better efficacy, nobody knows, but doesn't seem to harm people. If they've had COVID and they've recovered, they're at no greater, they have no additional safety concerns compared to someone who hasn't had COVID.
Okay. Tom, I'm going to bring it back to you. Based on the medical facts that Dr. Segretti has provided us with, what are some issues for employers who are thinking about adopting a mandatory vaccination policy?
All right. Well, I've been wavering on whether or not a written policy is necessary, especially as the legal and medical issues continue to evolve. We have a new administration in Washington, which may take a less employer-friendly approach in terms of agency guidance. I mean, just last week, for example, President Biden issued an executive order instructing OSHA to revise its guidelines on COVID-19 and consider issuing temporary standards. Temporary standards would be enforceable as opposed to guidance, which is merely guidance. With respect to a policy that I would suggest employers have, it would be a prevention policy under OSHA. We can talk about that a little later if there's time. But in terms of mandatory vaccinations, I've been sort of monitoring what's out there. I've seen a lot of policies. Quite frankly, a lot of them are not very good. So one piece of advice is don't get your policy off the internet. Look, what are policies good for? They set expectations and they set the requirements and the policy objectives of the employer. They can also set standards for non-compliance, even to holding somebody out in actual discipline. One of the questions from the audience has been, can we terminate somebody for non-compliance? Well, the answer is yes, but there are many, many steps you can take before that. You can offer incentives, you can do written warnings, you can suspend, you can hold them out of service, you can hold them out of their particular job if it's a public facing, for example. Going back to policies, which I think is the focus of your question, Lee, I saw a policy once that said that employees who have contraindications or some medical issues should have a sticker on their ID badges indicating as much. That's almost tantamount to having like the scarlet letter that you're parading around. I think that's just a horrible idea. So if you're going to have a policy on mandatory vaccinations, make sure it's flexible, make sure it's phased a little bit, make sure that it provides for individualized assessments of religious and disability concerns. Look, you can have a policy that states that if vaccinations are available and you don't get it, you can't come into the office. A major law firm last week was one of the first to set that policy. They're a national law firm. Like most policies, the general rule and my philosophy has always been, don't box yourself in. Don't commit yourself to certain actions where you minimize employer and supervisor discretion. A poorly thought out policy, quite frankly, is worse than no policy at all.
Okay, Tom, as a follow-up to that, what about a situation where we have a union representing a majority of the employees of an employer? Can the employer act unilaterally and impose a rule on mandatory vaccinations?
Well, I'll give you a lawyer's answer to that. It depends. It depends on the collective bargaining agreement that's in place. And if you're in the process of negotiating your first collective bargaining, it means you have to keep in place the current employer policies and rules. So let's assume that in the majority of circumstances, you're going to be dealing with an existing CBA. The first place you're going to look for is to see whether it contains a safety clause or a safety provision dealing with those types of issues. Those types of clauses may allow employers to adopt policy that promote the health and safety of the workforce. If that's the case, you might be able to shoehorn a mandatory vaccination policy into that. You can also look at your management rights clause to see how broad it is and see if it allows you to act unilaterally. If the answer is no on both of those, in other words, you don't have a safety provision and you don't have a management rights clause, which really opens the door to unilateral action, then the safe, conservative, and prudent approach is to consider it a mandatory subject of bargaining, raise it with the union. What I found, it's all about approach. I have not yet encountered a union who really doesn't share an employer's goal of making sure the workforce is vaccinated. Nobody wants to get sick. So if it's handled properly, this should really not be an issue. I would urge you to treat your union as a partner. Do not act unilaterally without notice.
And Tom, I think in one of your prior answers, you mentioned offering incentives to employees who receive the vaccine. What kind of legal issues are there with that?
Well, generally incentives are okay. Employers that we represent, for example, have offered paid time off, or I should say considering it, paid time off to get the vaccine, paid time off if there's a negative reaction, a one-time stipend even to encourage employees to get the vaccine, perhaps an extra vacation day or an extra PTO day. What's important for employers to realize is all of these are taxable. If the employer has a wellness plan, vaccinations may be covered under the wellness plan, and you have to take a look at that. And then your incentives may be limited by what's available under a wellness plan. And there's usually a 30% value cap, which is based on self-only, the cost of self-only insurance coverage at the employer's lowest cost program. The legal question is, how do you treat individuals who can't get the vaccination due to a medical condition? Do you discriminate because they can't get these incentives? They can't get the cash reward that other people might get. I wouldn't be surprised if that argument is made at some point down the road. Perhaps strict compliance with alternatives that we can consider in the workplace. In other words, accommodations could also trigger the reward. Again, what you want to do is you want to avoid further claims made against the employer because they have done something nice for the employees. They've given them incentives. You just want to make sure everybody has the opportunity to earn these incentives, even those who have accommodations against the vaccines because of religious or disability considerations.
Okay, I'm going to ask some questions now, assuming an employer has a mandatory vaccination policy in place. What happens if an individual comes and asks that employer for an accommodation? So Tom, we'll start with you on the legal side. How should an employer practically evaluate the request for an accommodation?
Well, the short answer is you treat it like an existing disability, whether it's under the ADA or applicable state law, or if it's a religious accommodation, you just treat it like that. You engage in the interactive process for any disability issue, for example. You have the right to understand the condition that might be impacted by the vaccine. Employers don't have to operate in a vacuum. The interactive process is designed to share information and it requires the employees to be cooperative in sharing information. So you have the right to ask the employees for an explanatory note or confirmation from their physician if you want, just like any other disability that may come into play. You know, I would imagine, and Dr. Segretti, you may confirm this, but you know, a lot of the medical conditions that employers are going to confront, you know, may not be because of a disability, but may be because of a historic allergic reaction that they may have to other vaccines, the flu vaccine, for example. Or there might be a contraindication with another prescription drug the employee is taking. Or it might be a timing issue, you know. For example, I just got my shingles vaccination, and I was told I can't get COVID for 2 to 4 weeks. The key in doing this is to make sure that you as employers, HR professionals, and lawyers don't make medical judgments. If you have questions, have the employee go back to the doctor, or you can consult your own occupational medicine specialist or an infectious disease specialist like Dr. Segretti. Employers typically go astray when they make uninformed decisions about a medical condition. And because if you make uninformed decisions, you're really not going to be able to come up with an effective accommodation.
Dr. Segretti, I'm going to go over to you on sort of the same issue, but from the medical viewpoint. If an employee was coming to the employer and asserting that they have a health condition or a disability that puts them at risk for receiving a vaccination, what kind of information should an employer be trying to gather from that employee to evaluate that concern?
Yeah, I think what's important is to get a history of what the condition is and how long it's been there, what kind of reactions people have had in the past. We usually defer to their primary care doctor rather than making the decision for them, since their primary care doctor or provider would know more about what's going on and what the reactions are. And they may want to talk about why they think that they're going to have more of a problem, or because they don't want to disclose any of their personal health information. So if in those circumstances, we would ask them to come in with a note from their physician saying that they should not be required to get this vaccine, but it has to be usually, we would defer to a personal physician in that regard.
Got it. Tom, so if you're an employer and you've evaluated the concern, what would be some possible accommodations for someone who has a disability or a health condition that prevents them from getting the vaccine?
This is where, there's really not a lot new on the legal side, and it's where Dr. Segretti is probably provides the best, but the accommodations are probably ones you've already been doing. Working from home, assignment to a different shift, changing work hours to permit employees to arrive early or come in late, and so they don't have to ride the elevators. It may be congested, so they can take a different train that may be less populated. Changing the location of an office assignment to a less populated area. Issuance of appropriate PPE, personal protective equipment, depending upon the circumstances. All of these are reasonable accommodations that a lot of employers have already been doing. The problem is that when you're dealing with someone who, if they contract COVID, could be a threat to themselves or to the public or to their co-employees, that's where it may be then accommodation is not possible, and you might have to hold the employee out of service. That's an unfortunate circumstance. And before you make that determination, you want to make sure that you've exhausted not only all of your ideas about accommodations, but all of the employees' ideas about accommodations.
So we've been talking a lot about accommodations for health conditions. Let's switch to another type of accommodation. Tom, how would an employer know if someone truly has a sincere religious belief, which is the basis of the objection to the vaccination?
I saw that question in the questions that are coming in, and it's probably the toughest question, to tell you the truth. As an employer, you have a right to discuss and learn about the employees' religious beliefs and practices. Hinshaw has been representing hospitals for decades and decades in their labor and employment matters, and we've already dealt with this issue a lot with mandatory flu vaccinations during flu season for many years. And religious objections are I don't want to say common, but they arise from time to time. Let me give you a good example. Christian Scientists would be a good example. Anti-vaccination is not part of their dogma, as I understand their religious beliefs, and church members are free to make their own determinations and all life decisions in obedience to the law and in obedience to their religious beliefs. Those decisions aren't imposed by the church, but nevertheless, they may be sincerely held. I'll give you another example. You may have read about issues in Brooklyn, New York, with respect to Hasidic Jews refusing the measles vaccination. So there may be groups within a particular religion that either are more strict, more observant, or may have different beliefs than the rest. So we shouldn't make judgments. Always err on the side of caution when you're dealing with religious accommodations, and assume that your employees are acting in good faith, and then take all the other steps that may exist as possible accommodations.
Okay, and then Tom, this is an issue that has kind of come up in a couple of your answers, but I'll just ask it directly. If there's an employer who is not unionized and they have a mandatory vaccine policy, if there is an employee or a group of employees who refuse the vaccine, what can the employer do? Can they terminate those employees? What are the options?
Yeah, and I saw those questions. I know that there's couple of questions about whether you can terminate an employee. As I said, it should be a phased approach. But remember, it is not just unionized employees who have rights under the National Labor Relations Act. All employees, even management employees to a certain extent, have what we call Section 7 rights, which permit employees to take concerted action for, and I'm going to use a legal phrase here, mutual aid and protection regarding terms and conditions of employment, and the safety or efficacy of a vaccine and the requirement that it's mandatory would be considered a term and condition of employment. And there are situations where even a single employee who may raise safety or other issues on behalf of a broader group of employees would be considered to be engaged in concerted action. So the important thing is when an employee raises concerns like that, assume that they are engaging in protected activity and assume that your greatest risk is retaliation. This is one of those areas where when you're dealing with an employee like that, you're going to want to consult your legal team, whether it's in-house or whether it is an outside counsel, to determine whether or not discipline or other remedial measures can be taken for violation of a mandatory vaccination policy. Keep in mind that if somebody does file an unfair labor practice charge under the National Labor Relations Act, the NLRB is very effective. They move very quickly. You can go from investigation to complaint in probably 6 to 8 weeks. And I've had some conversations with board agents recently in anticipation of this webinar, and this is definitely on their radar. So the short answer is be prudent. If you have questions regarding whether an employee is engaged in protected concerted activity, call your lawyer. I hate to say that too many times, but in this particular instance, that would be the conservative course of action.
And then just one follow-up for you, Tom, and then we'll get it back to Dr. Segretti. I know we've got some public employers in the audience today. So what about a public employer? Are any of the rules we've been covering regarding mandatory vaccination policies or incentives or accommodation requests different for our public employers?
Public employers tend to be more heavily unionized depending upon the location. But the same principles that I identified before in terms of the review of the collective bargaining agreements exist. Keep in mind the National Labor Relations Act doesn't cover public employers, but state law will. Almost all states have provisions. Illinois, for example, has the Illinois Labor Relations Act. Some states, like California, for example, have specific statutes on what is and what is not a mandatory subject of bargaining for collective bargaining purposes. And you are going to need to consider your local laws if you're a public employer, because they are likely a little bit more expansive than what's required under the National Labor Relations Act. But generally speaking, public employers too can consider and potentially enforce mandatory vaccination policies.
Okay, Dr. Segretti, some more questions on the vaccine itself. What are the most common side effects of the vaccine?
Well, by far the most common side effect is a sore arm and pain, swelling at the injection site was seen in about 80 to 90% of the people in the studies, and by far the most common side effect. Few people, less than 10%, developed a slight fever, headache, muscle aches, fatigue. Less than 5% had severe reactions, such as severe headache or severe myalgia or severe muscle pains. Less than 1%, only about 2 in 1,000 had reactions so severe that they couldn't go to work the next day. So overall, very well tolerated. I know that there have been some concerns about neurologic problems, but the neurologic issues that have been seen with these vaccines have not been more frequent than what's seen in the general population, either with Bell's palsy, and I haven't heard of any reports of Guillain-Barré yet. So with either of the vaccines, and about 30 million people have received vaccine in the US so far. So seem to be very well tolerated, doesn't seem to result in a lot of people calling in sick the next day.
Okay, great. Can employees become sick with COVID from the vaccine?
Not from the vaccine. Both of these vaccines do not contain either dead virus or weakened virus. These are vaccines that work by delivering messenger RNA to the body. The messenger RNA gets into your cells. The messenger RNA is a blueprint for production of something called spike protein. Your cells produce the spike protein. Your body immune system recognizes the spike protein, develops antibodies and an immune reaction to the spike protein, and then the spike protein goes away after a few days. And then if you ever get exposed to COVID, then your body recognizes the spike protein on the virus and kills the virus because it recognizes the spike protein. So, that's the way the mRNA vaccines work, and both Moderna and Pfizer are messenger RNA vaccines.
Okay, that is very helpful. Does the vaccine provide long-term protection, like an immunization for measles, or is it something where people will need to get an annual shot, like a flu shot?
Well, unfortunately, this virus is an RNA virus. An RNA virus tend to mutate a little frequently than some other viruses. Fortunately, the coronavirus is on the lower end of mutation rate compared to other RNA viruses, but we're already variants or mutants that maybe will be less affected by the current vaccine. So the UK variant will probably be well covered by the current vaccines, and that's by far the most common one we're seeing in the US right now. But there's a variant from South Africa and one from Brazil that perhaps will be more of a problem in terms of the current vaccines, and current vaccines may not be quite as effective against those variants as the wild type coronavirus or the UK variant. And again, we expect to see variants in the future. And so we don't have an answer yet as to how long these will work, but I think if things didn't mutate, probably it would be a one-time vaccine, but since the virus does mutate, I expect that it'll be more like flu vaccine, and they'll have to develop a vaccine that's more effective against that particular variant. And we probably will need more regular vaccinations, whether it's once a year, once 2 years, once every 6 months, nobody knows yet. But I suspect that we'll need modifications of the vaccine in the future and get revaccinated in the future. And that's one of the advantages of the newer technology with mRNA is that you can make a new vaccine very quickly and change it very quickly to address whichever variant is most prevalent at that time.
Okay, great. This is a question that came in prior to the webinar that I thought was one that a lot of employers might be grappling with. So if we have an employer who would like to make the vaccine mandatory for employees who have regular contact with the public, but then just encourage it for everyone else. So maybe part of the workforce is engaging with the public and part of the workforce is behind a desk somewhere. From an infectious disease perspective, Dr. Segretti, does that kind of policy make sense?
Well, it depends on the point of view. If it's from a societal standpoint, maybe it doesn't make that much sense, because from a societal standpoint, I think you want everyone protected, so there's fewer cases everywhere and fewer people getting infected and less transmission in the entire population. From a localized standpoint, for example, here at the hospital, I'm most concerned about our employees getting vaccinated so they can come into work and they can take care of patients. But vaccinating our 12,000 employees isn't necessarily going to affect the entire city of Chicago. And I do think that you need both. You need broad-based vaccination to decrease the total burden of the infection, and you need to vaccinate, make sure that the people who are at greatest risk and most essential to society to get vaccinated as well, which is one of the reasons why we have this framework of the 1A, 1B, 1C. But from a public health standpoint, I think you want as many people vaccinated as possible, so that if there is such a thing as herd immunity, you do get to that point and you have less transmission in the entire population.
Okay, the next question that I saw come in, and it's one that I think I've read about and seen different viewpoints on. After receiving the vaccine, is it still possible to transmit COVID to others?
The short answer is we don't know yet, but what we're seeing is that, first of all, people have gotten reinfected, probably not that common, but people can get reinfected, and people can get infected after getting the vaccine because it's not 100%, and with the variants, it's probably even less than what's published in the trials. There are some data from the AstraZeneca trial in the UK that people who got the vaccine were less likely to test positive for the virus. So this is kind of a surrogate for transmissibility. Most other vaccines do decrease risk of transmission. We're looking to see whether or not that happens with these vaccines. My expectation is that it will, but to what extent and for how long hasn't been established yet. So yes, it is possible for people who get the vaccine to get the virus. And while I think the risk of transmission will be much, much less than people who don't get the vaccine, it's still possible.
Okay, and this one is similar but slightly different. The question was, I had heard that the vaccine manages symptoms but does not protect an individual from contracting the virus. Is that true?
Well, like I said, it's people can still get infected or get the organism in their body, not get sick, still have it in their body. But the question is, can they still transmit it to someone else? That's what we don't know yet. Again, I think it's very unlikely because it depends on how much of the virus you have. And even though we're finding viruses at a high enough level that can be a risk to someone else, we don't know that yet. Again, my expectation is that vaccination will markedly decrease transmission, and that it'll be very good at being able to inhibit transmission of the organism. And I think that's a big deal with some of these new variants. And if the virus isn't replicating in your body, we're not going to get that many new variants. So it'll affect how many mutations we're seeing. But again, we have to vaccinate a lot of people to be able to see so-called herd immunity and be able to decrease transmission of the infection.
Okay, and we just have about a minute left. I'm going to give it to you, Tom, to kind of tie us up on the legal side. What does the information that Dr. Segretti just provided on the vaccine mean for our workplace COVID policies, even with the workforce coming back to work that is vaccinated? And then maybe you could also quickly touch on the new OSHA guidance that came out.
Well, the new OSHA guidance just came out last Friday, and I'll talk to marketing whether we can send that to everyone who's a participant in this call. We're going to try to do that. I think it's important you see it. The OSHA guidance is really focused on education, preventative steps you can take, availability of PPE, training, identifying individuals with active symptoms, making sure that they're isolated and go home. With respect to the mandatory side of things, I will touch on something that John said in terms of the societal benefits of sort of phasing it in. You know, on the legal side, you can phase in who is going to be, who will be subject to a mandatory policy and who will not. Take the example of a manufacturing facility where you have large numbers of individuals working in close proximity on the production floor. You may require the vaccine for them, but in the back office, you may want to phase in mandatory vaccine for those employees later because they can adhere to social distancing. The mask can be more effective. The risk of transmission is less. So you can do that. You just have to be aware of the fact that you may be putting your rationale as to who's subject to the mandatory policy and who's not at issue, especially if you discipline or provide incentives or provide some other remedial or take some other remedial action. You could be subject to a discrimination claim, for example. So the bottom line of all of this is we can have mandatory policies. We just have to be mindful of those 5 legal concerns I addressed before, and then take into consideration what Dr. Segretti was talking about in terms of the efficacy.
Okay, well, I think we are out of time. Thank you again, Dr. Segretti, for all of the information and for taking the time to be with us today. We really appreciate it. And thank you for everyone who participated. You can reach out to Tom or I at Hinshaw with any follow-up questions. Thanks so much.